It started with a birthday. A little girl turned 8, balloons dancing in the wind as the smell of cake filled a modest Wichita home. Her father was smiling in the backyard, grilling burgers. Her mother, laughing gently, lit the candles. And somewhere, far from that cheerful party, in a dusty city library computer, a single file was quietly downloaded. It looked harmless. But it wasn't. That file would crack open a secret hidden for 30 years. A secret that wore glasses, sat in a church pew, and murdered 10 innocent people. This isn't just the story of a serial killer. This is the story of how a man lived 2 lives, and how one tiny digital slip unraveled them both. He woke up at exactly 6:15 every morning, even on Sundays. There was no alarm. He didn't need one. His body was trained, his routine so precise that it functioned like clockwork. His feet would touch the floor in the same order, left first, then right. He'd sit on the edge of the bed for exactly 10 seconds before reaching for his glasses, folded neatly on the nightstand. The air was still. The house was quiet. And for Dennis Rader, the silence was the most comforting sound in the world. Downstairs, the coffee pot was already prepped from the night before. He liked things done early. Pre-planned. Controlled. As the coffee brewed, the scent filled the kitchen, dark and slightly burnt, just how he liked it. He stood by the window, watching the street outside. No movement. No cars. Just the faint golden light of dawn stretching over Park City, Kansas. He opened the newspaper and didn't read the headlines. He scanned them, quickly, just to confirm that the world hadn't fallen apart overnight. He liked knowing things were in their place. That the machine was still running. That people still trusted what they saw. That was the illusion. And Dennis Rader was a master at keeping it alive. To anyone watching from the outside, he was nothing more than a middle-aged man with thinning hair and wire-rimmed glasses. A husband. A father. A man who paid his taxes, attended church, and worked as a compliance officer for the local government. Some found him a little intense, maybe too focused on rules. Others called him helpful, even friendly. He volunteered at church. Helped neighbors with their trash bins. Called out kids who didn't mow their lawns. Nobody thought much of him, and that's exactly what he wanted. But behind the trimmed hedges and neatly parked cars of suburban Park City, behind the hollow politeness and neighborhood smiles, he was hiding something so dark, so violently inconceivable, that even those closest to him, his wife, his children, his congregation, would later say they had no idea. They believed him when he said grace at dinner. They trusted him when he handed out communion wafers. They never once suspected that he had killed 10 people. That he had bound them. Tortured them. Watched the light leave their eyes. And then walked away, emotionless, before sitting down at his desk to write about it like it was an entry in a diary. He called himself BTK. Bind. Torture. Kill. 3 words that were more than just a method, they were a ritual. A performance. A cycle that he controlled from start to finish. He planned his crimes like someone might plan a wedding. With lists. Sketches. Backup plans. He stalked his victims for weeks, sometimes months, studying their routines, taking notes on when they left for work, where they parked their car, which windows stayed open at night. He wrote scripts, literally, outlining how the scene should go. What tools he'd bring. How long he'd give himself. What photos he'd take afterward. Every detail mattered. Because for Dennis Rader, this wasn't just killing, it was art. But that side of him stayed hidden. Locked away behind his cold, unreadable face. The same face he wore when he handed out city code violations, wagging his finger at a neighbor with an unregistered boat. The same face he wore when he stood in front of the church as council president, speaking about mercy and patience and love. He believed in order. He lived by it. And yet, when the sun went down and the mask came off, he became something else. Something darker. Something hungry. The world first heard of BTK in 1974. A family had been murdered inside their home, parents and 2 children, strangled, bound, their lives taken in silence. The killer had broken in, waited, and executed the attack with terrifying precision. There was no clear motive. No robbery. Just control. And terror. Over the next several years, more bodies turned up. Each one had the same signature. The same bindings. The same cold detachment. Then came the letters. Taunting notes mailed to newspapers, boasting of his crimes, demanding credit. He wanted people to know who he was. He wanted to be feared. And he was. For a time, then, in 1991, the murders stopped. No one heard from BTK again. People wondered if he'd been arrested for something else. Or maybe he'd died. Life moved on. Wichita grew quieter. And for over a decade the case sat cold. But Dennis Rader hadn't stopped thinking about it. He hadn't stopped fantasizing. He just got older. Slower. His kids had grown. His job took more energy. His knees hurt. But the cravings were still there. The desire to dominate. To be in control. To be seen. Because more than anything, Dennis Rader was driven by a sick hunger to be acknowledged. And in 2004, something in him snapped. Maybe it was boredom. Maybe it was ego. But after nearly 25 years, he reached out again. A letter was sent to a local news station. Then a cereal box was left on a park bench, containing trinkets and photographs from a decades-old murder. The city gasped. BTK was back. The headlines returned. The fear returned. And for Dennis Rader, it felt like home. But what he didn't understand was how much the world had changed. Back in the 70s, he had the upper hand. There were no surveillance cameras on every corner. No DNA databases. No metadata tracking. Now, even a digital file could carry your fingerprint. Still, he believed he was smarter than the police. Smarter than the press. Smarter than the world. When investigators used a newspaper ad to ask if he'd be willing to send communication on a floppy disk, assuring him it couldn't be traced, he believed them. And that single decision would become his undoing. Because the moment he sent that disk, thinking he was invincible, he gave them everything they needed. The username on the file. The location it was saved. The church computer it was used on. They had him. And he never even saw it coming. In the days before his arrest, Dennis Rader still went about his life like nothing had changed. He was helping his daughter plan her wedding. He was attending council meetings, making notes about stray dogs and fencing violations. He waved to neighbors. He smiled at the gas station clerk. He wore his mask perfectly. But behind closed doors, in the quiet of his den, something darker was bubbling to the surface. The thrill had returned. His letters were being read again. His cryptic puzzles were making the news. BTK was relevant again. And to him, that meant everything. For decades he'd lived in a paradox, craving invisibility and attention in equal measure. He needed to not be caught, yes. But he also needed to be acknowledged. The letters weren't just taunts. They were proof that he existed. Proof that he mattered. That he wasn't just another aging man with a city job and a stale routine. That he was someone. And in the twisted framework of his ego, BTK was someone worth remembering. His communication with the police started cautiously. He sent riddles. Old photos from crime scenes. Clues he believed only the real killer could know. Each package he sent reignited his sense of power. It made him feel like he was in control again. The entire city leaned in, waiting, wondering, was it really him? Could BTK have survived all this time without being caught? Was he back to kill again? And then came the moment that changed everything. A floppy disk. Harmless in appearance. Purple. Labeled. Inside, he had included a message, his latest puzzle, another breadcrumb on the trail he was constructing. But what he didn't understand was that even deleted files leave traces. Metadata, the invisible fingerprints of the digital age, told a different story. One the killer couldn't erase. When investigators opened the disk, they found more than just his note. They found the creator's username. It was a single word. Dennis. And the document had been last saved at Christ Lutheran Church. It was small, almost forgettable, a quiet detail buried in the digital code. But it cracked open everything. A few clicks. A Google search. Church Bulletin Archives. And just like that, his real name surfaced. Dennis Rader. Married. 2 children. President of the Church Council. City Compliance Officer. A man who had lived less than 30 minutes from the first murder scene all along. As detectives reviewed his background, pieces began falling into place like a long-forgotten jigsaw puzzle. His physical appearance matched composite sketches. He drove a black Jeep Cherokee. Witnesses had mentioned a similar vehicle. He owned properties that aligned with unsolved surveillance logs. But none of it mattered unless they had DNA. So they watched him quietly. They didn't confront him. They waited. They followed him to the grocery store, to his office, to his home. Every movement was tracked, every object he touched observed. Until finally, they found their chance. His daughter had recently visited a medical clinic, routine, unremarkable. But her DNA was on file. And it was close enough. A familial match. Enough to draw a line between a father and the murders that had haunted Kansas for 3 decades. February 25, 2005. A cold morning. The sky was the color of old paper, and the wind cut through the city like it carried secrets. Rader was driving home from lunch when he was pulled over. He thought it was a traffic stop. He smiled politely. Then the badge was flashed. His name was spoken. And for the first time, Dennis Rader saw the end. There was no scene. No resistance. He didn't run. He didn't fight. He simply stared forward, the weight of his ego folding in on itself like a paper mask crushed in a child's hand. Inside the interrogation room, he was strangely cooperative. Calm. Almost relieved. He admitted it all, but not out of remorse. He wanted to explain. To walk the detectives through every detail, every decision, like he was presenting a project at work. He spoke clinically, with disturbing composure. He recounted each murder, described the planning, the emotions, or lack thereof, he felt. There were no tears. No anger. Just a man who believed the story of his own monstrosity was worth telling. Psychologists would later describe him as a classic narcissist. Not just because of his obsession with control, but because of his grandiosity. He didn't see himself as evil. He saw himself as special. Superior. Smarter than the rest. Even in confession, he tried to frame his crimes as methodical achievements. He talked about his projects, about the satisfaction of completing them, about the disappointment when things didn't go exactly as planned. Like a failed recipe. Like a missed opportunity. The courtroom was packed during his sentencing. Victims' families sat shoulder to shoulder, gripping tissues, staring at the man who had shattered their lives. Some were angry. Some were hollow. Others simply stared, as if trying to understand how someone so ordinary could carry so much darkness inside them. Rader gave a long statement, rambling, self-serving, cold. He described the murders again, offering details no one asked for. It wasn't an apology. It was a performance. His last chance to be the center of the story. When the judge handed down 10 consecutive life sentences, Rader barely reacted. He was escorted out quietly, disappearing down a hallway, his glasses catching the overhead light one last time. There were no screams. No closing statement. Just the end of a long lie. But the story didn't end with the handcuffs. The aftermath left scars far beyond the victims. His wife filed for an emergency divorce and vanished from public view. His daughter, blindsided, had to reconcile the man who read her bedtime stories with the man who posed victims and took photographs of their lifeless bodies. His church community fell into chaos. Everything he built, every illusion of decency and order, crumbled into dust overnight. The name Dennis Rader became more than just a criminal case. It became a study in duality. A warning. Proof that monsters don't always hide in shadows. Sometimes they hold doors open. Sometimes they ask about your day. Sometimes they live next door, and the hardest part is, they believe they're just like you. He was the kind of man who could disappear in a room full of people without ever leaving. He had that quiet, bureaucratic presence, a man who tucked his shirt too tightly, blinked too often, and smiled with no warmth behind it. Dennis Rader didn't attract attention because he didn't want it, not in the traditional sense. He didn't crave applause in a crowd. He wanted control in the shadows. That's where he felt most alive. And to understand why he became the way he did, you have to go further back. Long before the floppy disk, before the first victim, before anyone ever called him BTK. As a child, Rader seemed ordinary. But even then, the edges were already starting to warp. He grew up in Wichita, Kansas, the oldest of 4 brothers. His father worked long shifts for the telephone company. His mother stayed home but was emotionally distant. Rader would later say he felt ignored, forgotten, unseen. And somehow, this lack of attention didn't make him quiet, it made him angry. Not outwardly. He didn't throw tantrums or scream. He just began to fantasize. About control. About punishment. About binding the people who ignored him, silencing them, forcing them to notice him in the worst possible way. By the time he was a teenager, those fantasies had evolved into rituals. He'd draw pictures in secret, of women tied up, helpless, eyes wide with fear. He'd cut images out of catalogs and hide them under his mattress. He strangled small animals, just to see how it felt. Not out of hatred. Out of curiosity. A detached, clinical curiosity that would never leave him. In private, he began tying himself up. Practicing. Timing how long he could hold a knot. Posing in front of a mirror in makeshift bindings. And when the rush wore off, he'd tuck everything away and go back to class like nothing had happened. He joined the Air Force after high school. Served without incident. His record was clean. He followed orders well. Kept his bed tight, his uniform sharper than most. He smiled when he needed to. Nodded at the right moments. His superiors saw him as reliable, if a little stiff. But inside, the fantasies kept growing. He collected detective magazines during service. He read crime stories obsessively, always drawn to tales of helpless victims and mysterious killers. It didn't scare him, it thrilled him. Not because he wanted justice, but because he wanted to be the one getting away with it. After returning from the military, he married a woman named Paula. They moved into a modest home in Park City. He got a job working for a meatpacking company, then moved into security. Eventually, he became a compliance officer, a job that gave him the authority he craved, legally. He measured grass. He cited people for having dogs off-leash. He walked around neighborhoods with a clipboard and a badge, and he liked it. Not because he was making the city better, but because it gave him a reason to correct people. To be in charge. To dominate without raising suspicion. He was in his late 20s when he committed his first murders. It was 1974. The Otero family. He broke into their home in the morning. He knew they'd be there. He had watched them for weeks. He knew their routines, when they left, when they returned, which door they used. The crime was brutal, precise, detached. He treated them not like people, but like pieces in a game. The planning had been meticulous, the execution calculated. It was about power, not rage. There was no frenzy, no emotion. Just method. He later admitted that he didn't feel much afterward. No guilt. No horror. Just a strange high that faded into a kind of emptiness. A vacuum. And once it passed, the fantasies returned. Stronger. Sharper. Louder. It was never about the act alone, it was about the build-up. The surveillance. The notes. The control. The post-mortem posing. The letters he'd write to newspapers. He wanted people to know what he had done, but not who he was. The perfect paradox. A killer with a need to be seen, as invisible. He gave himself the name. BTK. Bind. Torture. Kill. It was his brand. His identity. He created logos, drew symbols, made word puzzles, mailed taunting letters filled with twisted pride. And yet, in between these acts of horror, he went back to normal life. He was a scout leader. A father. A man who worked at the church fish fry and taught his kids how to pitch a tent. He lived in two worlds, and he kept them separate with frightening ease. That ability to compartmentalize was the core of who he was. To Paula, he was dependable, even dull. He did the dishes. He helped with homework. He never came home late. She never once suspected that the man sleeping beside her had buried a mask and a pair of gloves in a storage unit across town, along with photographs of the dead posed like mannequins. He didn't just hide his secrets. He wove them into a life so routine that no one ever thought to look twice. And it worked. For years. The killings slowed. Eventually they stopped. Life caught up. His kids grew up. His body aged. And part of him believed he had buried BTK for good. But that was a lie. Because BTK wasn't a phase. It wasn't a mistake. It was who he really was. The silence wasn't peace. It was starvation. He tried to relive the rush through fantasies. He wrote in secret journals. He sketched. He made collages with clippings and tape. But the thrill wasn't the same. Not without the danger. Not without the city whispering his name in fear. He needed to feel that again. And so, when the news stopped talking about him, he lit the fire again. Quietly. One puzzle. One letter. One cereal box. He thought he could outsmart the world again. That the same city that had once hunted him without success would fall for his tricks once more. He wanted the myth to return. But this time, the world had changed. Technology had evolved. People were watching more closely. And as it turned out, the man who lived on control was about to lose all of it. He always believed he was the smartest man in the room. Not just smarter, cleverer, craftier, a step ahead. It wasn't arrogance in the traditional sense. It was deeper. More poisonous. Dennis Rader believed his mind worked differently from everyone else's, that his discipline, his planning, his control gave him an edge no one could touch. That belief became his shield. His reason to taunt the police. His reason to come back after 25 quiet years. And in the end, that same belief would destroy him. By 2004, the silence had become unbearable. BTK had become a ghost story, a whisper in true crime forums, the boogeyman of Kansas folklore. But to Dennis Rader, BTK was never gone. He was dormant, waiting. And Rader felt the world had forgotten him. Forgotten the fear. Forgotten the mystery. Forgotten the brilliance of what he had done. That craving to be acknowledged, more than the act of killing itself, was what drove him back into the spotlight. It began with a letter. A single envelope, left at a local news station. Inside was a photocopy of a victim's driver's license and some personal effects, items that had never been made public. It was a test. Rader wanted to see if the world would still remember. If the police would respond. If the news anchors would say his name. When they did, it gave him a thrill he hadn't felt in years. His pulse quickened. The hunger came roaring back. He started sending more packages. Leaving cereal boxes at parks, cryptic letters hidden inside library books, photocopied puzzles made from clipped words. They were all signed the same way, BTK. He referenced old murders, teased about new ones, and asked the media if they wanted to play again. It was a game to him, a chess match where only he knew all the pieces. And every move he made was another step toward reclaiming the attention he believed he deserved. But there was something different this time. Something looser. His letters weren't as sharp. His puzzles felt outdated. The world had changed more than he realized. And even though his messages were still cryptic, they weren't sophisticated. The same man who once stalked victims for weeks, who planned each murder like a military operation, was now relying on cereal boxes and floppy disks. Somewhere along the line, his ego had grown larger than his caution. The police, on the other hand, had learned. The cold case unit reopened BTK's file the moment the letters started arriving. Every piece of communication was scrutinized under modern technology, scanned for fingerprints, DNA, writing style. Psychologists studied the tone of his letters, comparing them to archived documents from the 70s. And behind the scenes, a quiet trap was forming. Then came the moment he couldn't resist. He asked the police, through one of his letters, if they could be honest with him. If he were to send a floppy disk, would they be able to trace it? The detectives crafted their response carefully. In a published newspaper ad, they told him no, it couldn't be tracked. That it was safe. That he could trust them. It worked. He sent the disk, purple, neatly labeled. It was dropped in a box near a local church, along with a note and a gold cross pendant. Inside the disk was a single file, a message from BTK, explaining his next riddle, wrapped in self-importance and grandiosity. What he didn't realize was that the metadata inside the file didn't just store the text. It stored everything. The last person who saved it. The computer it was saved on. The software used. The username was Dennis. The location? Christ Lutheran Church. A search of the church's website brought up one name tied to both the church council and city code enforcement, Dennis Rader. A quick background check confirmed he lived just miles from the original murder scenes. He drove a Jeep Cherokee, matching witness descriptions from an old report. His age, build, job, all lined up. But suspicion wasn't enough. They needed proof. So they watched him. They didn't knock on his door. They didn't let him know. Instead, they followed his routine. Watched his habits. Tracked his car. They needed a sample of his DNA. But he was cautious, disciplined, boring. He didn't smoke. Didn't discard coffee cups. Didn't leave anything behind. That's when investigators turned to his family. His daughter had recently visited a university health clinic. Her DNA was on file. A request was made. A sample was tested. It was a match. Not perfect, because it wasn't him directly, but close enough. A familial match that pointed unmistakably to her father. Now they had him. Still, the arrest had to be surgical. No risk. No mistakes. They waited for the right moment. February 25, 2005. A Friday. Rader had just finished his lunch break. He was driving through a suburban street when officers pulled him over. Calmly. Casually. He stepped out of the car, confused but polite. Then he was surrounded. Cuffed. His glasses slid slightly down his nose as he looked at the officers, not with fear, but with disbelief. Like a man who had been told the rules of the game had changed and no one had warned him. Back at the station, he didn't scream or protest. He didn't ask for a lawyer. Instead, he leaned in, almost eager. They asked him if he knew why he was there. He said, "I think you know why." What followed was one of the most disturbing confessions in criminal history. He laid it all out. Each murder. Each binding. Each name. He remembered everything. Every address. Every item he took. Every photo he snapped. He told them he had a dark side. A separate person inside him he sometimes called Factor X. It wasn't insanity. It wasn't possession. It was a label. A scapegoat. Another way to control the narrative. He was proud, in his own way. Calm. Detached. Describing each victim like a box on a checklist. He didn't weep. He didn't tremble. He explained. Demonstrated. Clarified. Because to him, it wasn't about guilt. It was about being understood. He wanted the investigators to see his brilliance, to marvel at how long he had eluded them. But he miscalculated again. They weren't marveling. They were disgusted. And even as the handcuffs closed around his wrists for the final time, Dennis Rader still believed the world would remember him not as a monster, but as a mastermind. In the quiet concrete halls of the Sedgwick County Jail, Dennis Rader no longer had a name. He was an inmate. A number. A case file stacked among thousands. And for a man who once believed himself to be a mythic figure, a mind too sharp to be caught, it was a crushing place to vanish. The world outside was still spinning, still moving forward without him. But inside those four walls, everything stopped. His rituals were gone. His routines meant nothing. No clipboard, no neatly pressed uniform, no neighbors to command. He was finally powerless. And that, more than the life sentence, was the real punishment. His cell was bare. A metal cot, a plastic mirror, a small desk. There were no photographs. No secret compartments. No place to store trophies. All the things he had once hidden in boxes and envelopes were now sitting in police evidence lockers, being studied by forensic analysts and behavioral psychologists. His drawings. His notes. His detailed diagrams of crime scenes. His twisted little fantasy projects. All of it stripped away and exposed to the world. At first, he didn't fully understand the weight of what was happening. He was more concerned with appearances. He shaved carefully, straightened his jumpsuit, polished his glasses with the corner of his sleeve. He made polite conversation with guards. He wanted them to see him as cooperative, normal. He still believed there was a version of himself that could be preserved, the version who went to church, who raised a family, who served his country. But the mask had already shattered. No one saw Dennis the Deacon anymore. They saw BTK. He was placed in solitary confinement for his own safety. Not because he posed a threat to others, but because the prison population was filled with people who had read about his crimes and would have gladly ended his life. He spent 23 hours a day alone, with 1 hour for exercise in a small concrete yard, surrounded by fencing. He walked in circles during that hour, head down, hands folded behind his back like a man pacing through his own funeral. His mind, though, never stopped. He wrote constantly, letters to journalists, to criminologists, to authors. He wanted to be part of the conversation. He wanted to explain. He offered himself up as a case study, a rare glimpse into the mind of a serial killer. He asked for interviews, sent pages of typed thoughts, titled his letters like chapters in an autobiography. He framed it all as education, as insight. But the truth was simpler. He couldn't stand being forgotten. He even compared himself to other killers. He ranked them, evaluated their techniques. He described how they lacked discipline, how their mistakes were sloppy, emotional, weak. In his mind, he was still different, still better. He saw himself as methodical, a craftsman of murder, someone who deserved recognition not just for what he had done, but how he had done it. And when journalists stopped answering, when books were written without consulting him, when documentaries used his name but not his words, he grew bitter. Like a playwright whose masterpiece had been stolen and misunderstood. Meanwhile, his family tried to disappear. His wife divorced him immediately, filing emergency paperwork and requesting her name be sealed from court records. She never visited him again. His daughter, who had once called him her hero, now couldn't say his name without trembling. She changed phone numbers, moved cities, hid from the press. And yet Rader still referred to them in letters. Still signed cards with, "Love, Dad." Still believed they would one day see past it all and understand. They never did. What haunted them most wasn't just the crimes. It was the duality. The way he had compartmentalized his life so perfectly. He never missed a birthday. Never raised his voice. He helped his daughter with science projects, hugged her when she was scared, watched cartoons with her on Saturday mornings. And all the while, he was hiding bondage ropes in locked drawers, stalking strangers after work, taking photographs of lifeless eyes and cataloging them like trophies. The betrayal was so complete, so impossible to comprehend, that healing from it wasn't just hard, it felt like a betrayal of their own reality. The community he left behind was no different. The members of Christ Lutheran Church, where he had once served as president, couldn't reconcile the truth. The man who had stood before them reading scripture had also stood over corpses, tying knots with calm, steady hands. The congregation disbanded within a year. The building was sold. The walls that had once echoed with hymns now carried a silence too heavy to bear, and the city of Wichita, forever marked by his legacy, tried to move on. But it wasn't easy. The murder sites remained. The victims' families remained. And even though BTK had been caught, even though he was behind bars, the sense of violation lingered. Because it hadn't been a stranger in the shadows. It had been a neighbor, a co-worker, a fellow churchgoer. He had waved to their children, complimented their dogs, borrowed tools from their garages. The horror wasn't just in what he had done, but in how close he had always been. Some residents still lock their doors twice at night. Some still remember the headlines. The unease doesn't fade, not fully. Because once you learn that evil can wear such an ordinary face, you never quite trust the ordinary again. In prison, Rader aged quickly. His posture stiffened. His hands trembled. His eyesight dimmed. But even as the years passed, even as the letters slowed, there was still a flicker behind his eyes, a small, pathetic spark that believed he might still be important. That someone somewhere would write to him, ask him questions. invite him to explain. Because that's what he had always wanted, not just the act, but the echo, the aftershock, the memory. But the world moved on without him. Slowly, steadily, quietly. And the man who once believed he was invisible, then invincible, was left to rot inside a cage, trapped not just by steel, but by the very need for control that had once set him free. Years passed, but Dennis Rader never really disappeared. His body aged, his voice grew raspier, and the fire in his letters dimmed, but his name remained lodged in the minds of those who had lived through the fear. BTK wasn't just a case file, he was a wound. The kind that never fully healed. He had taken so much more than lives. He had shattered the illusion of safety. He had proven, in the most horrifying way, that the devil doesn't always come with fangs or bloodshot eyes. Sometimes, he wears khakis and glasses. Sometimes, he brings your trash can in from the curb. Inside his cell, time slowed. The world stopped revolving around him. New serial killers emerged, new documentaries were made, new headlines took his place. And yet, something in him still believed he was different. That he wasn't forgotten. That one day, someone would need his insight again. He tried to make himself available. He mailed criminology students, offered to answer questions, sent charts, flow diagrams, even drawings of how he'd imagined his victims during his projects, as he still called them. But the letters weren't requests. They were performances. Little one-man shows scribbled onto lined paper, written in careful cursive, because even behind bars, he wanted to control how he was seen. He referred to his darker side as Factor X. He claimed it was a force, a presence, something outside of him that pushed him to kill. It was an illusion of separation. An excuse wrapped in fake mysticism. In reality, there was no second entity. It was always him. He was the planner, the watcher, the executioner. The same man who kissed his daughter goodnight was the man who tied ropes around necks and waited in closets with gloves and masks. He didn't hear voices. He didn't black out. He chose. Psychologists studied his letters, his interviews, his body language in court. He was labeled a malignant narcissist. A man who lacked true empathy but craved admiration. He didn't want to be hated. He wanted to be understood, even admired. That was what made him so unsettling, not just his crimes, but the sheer normalcy he wore like a second skin. He was never the monster under the bed. He was the man who built the bed and smiled while doing it. One investigator, who had worked the BTK case since the 70s, once said the hardest part wasn't tracking down a killer. It was realizing that the killer had been living among them the entire time. That they had passed him in the grocery store. That he had lectured them about grass height or vehicle permits while secretly fantasizing about binding and silencing them. That he had been in their community meetings, suggesting rule changes and smiling for group photos. For years after his sentencing, victims' families tried to rebuild. Some moved away. Some changed their names. Some leaned into advocacy, speaking about the realities of surviving such a loss. But healing wasn't linear. It was jagged, raw, often silent. There were birthdays that never came. Empty chairs at Thanksgiving. Rooms no one could step into anymore. What Rader stole couldn't be repaid, and he never really tried. His letters to families, when they existed, were often void of true apology. They were reflections. Writings about his compulsions. Detached observations. Never true remorse. Because remorse requires empathy, and Rader didn't have any. Not really. What he had was curiosity, routine, ego, and a void he tried to fill with control. Eventually, he stopped writing as much. His health began to fail. He developed back problems. He needed more medication. His meals became smaller, his voice more strained. His cell remained sterile and gray. The world outside kept changing. Technology advanced. Society shifted. But Rader was stuck, frozen in the year he was caught, like a rotting artifact from another era. His last few interviews became less about insight and more about delusion. He spoke of himself as a case study, as if he were offering the world a gift. But there was nothing left to give. Only the same stories. The same routines. The same hollow phrases. And somewhere in Kansas, beyond the prison walls, those who remembered the fear continued to breathe through it. They raised their children with a sharper eye. They paid attention to the neighbors who seemed a little too controlling, a little too invisible. Because BTK had taught them something horrible and unforgettable, that evil doesn't come with warning signs. It doesn't look the way we think it should. Sometimes it smiles too much. Sometimes it never raises its voice. Sometimes it's the man who tells you to follow the rules. Rader may have lived out the rest of his days in a cinderblock cage, but he still believed, deep down, that his story mattered. That BTK would be remembered. That someone, somewhere, would speak his name. He underestimated something, though, something small but powerful. He believed the fear he created would outlast everything. But time has a way of dulling fear, of shifting focus, of letting other voices rise, and slowly, piece by piece, his name began to lose its edge. It became less of a threat, more of a warning. A cautionary tale, not of horror, but of blindness. A lesson in how someone can hide behind the ordinary for years. A reminder that the scariest monsters are the ones who know exactly how to pass for human. He never thought it would end like this. Old. Alone. Invisible. Not feared, not admired, just forgotten. The noise that once defined Dennis Rader's existence had faded into a dull hum. The headlines were gone. The interviews had stopped. The letters no longer arrived. The prison guards, once curious about the man behind the myth, now saw just another aging inmate with failing knees and a tendency to repeat himself. His story, once terrifying, had become background static in the long, endless hum of prison life. In his earliest days behind bars, he had believed there would be legacy. That professors would dissect his writings. That books would be written with his name carved into their titles. That maybe, somehow, he would become a case study in infamy. But as the years passed, his influence shrank. More serial killers were caught. More shocking stories surfaced. And BTK, 3 letters that once paralyzed an entire city, began to sound more like a relic than a threat. He tried to reclaim it, even behind bars. He filled notebooks with diagrams and timelines. He mailed letters to crime authors offering his expertise. He gave his twisted version of mentorship, sending hand-drawn schematics of his old stalking routes. He wrote about how the media had misunderstood him, about how his actions were the result of a deep internal drive. Factor X. He'd write again and again, clinging to that label like it meant something profound, like it was some spiritual parasite that had taken him over. But no one was fooled. What he called Factor X was just his need, his thirst, his desire to control. Eventually, the mailroom grew quiet. Fewer requests came through. Fewer people cared. Even the occasional crime podcaster, hoping to bait him into another grotesque anecdote, began turning to fresher names. More sensational cases. Rader wasn't unique anymore. He was an echo. A shadow. A man out of time. He watched the years move without him. A television in the common room flickered with images of a world he no longer recognized. Phones with no buttons. Faces behind screens. Protests he couldn't understand. Tragedies that didn't involve him. He saw people celebrating victories, mourning losses, moving on. They had lives. He had memories. The worst kind. The kind you can't escape from, even when the lights go out and the cell door clicks shut. Sometimes, in the middle of the night, he'd wake up and forget where he was. For a brief second, he was back in his house. He could almost hear the dishwasher running, the creak of floorboards upstairs. He could imagine his wife asleep, his daughter safe. The illusion would last maybe 10 seconds. Then the hard air would hit his lungs again, and the metallic scent of confinement would crawl back into his throat. The cell was cold. Always cold. Not from temperature, but from the kind of silence that clings to you. There were no more projects. No more puzzles. The ropes were gone. The plans were gone. The mask was gone. All that was left was the man beneath it, a hollow, aging thing sitting on a steel bench, trying to remember what it felt like to be feared. Sometimes he'd look at the small mirror bolted to his wall. His face had changed. The deep lines on his forehead looked like carvings, his skin pale and thinned by fluorescent light. His eyes, once so calculating, were now glassy and dull. But what struck him most was how ordinary he looked. There was nothing in that reflection that spoke of evil or brilliance. No menace. No fire. Just a face that had never really mattered. That realization, when it came, was slow. It wasn't a dramatic collapse. It was a whisper. A slow erosion of certainty. He had always believed he was special. That he was smarter. But the truth, the unbearable truth, was that he was just another man who wanted to be more than he was. And in trying to become something powerful, something feared, he had destroyed everything that had ever truly belonged to him. The last time his daughter spoke about him publicly, she said, "The man who raised me died the day he was arrested." She didn't visit. She didn't write. He kept her childhood drawings in a folder under his bed, taken during intake. Every few months, he would pull them out like they were still warm. Like they could pull him back into a time when he mattered for the right reasons. But even those drawings had begun to fade. The paper yellowed. The ink bled. Like everything else in his life, they were dissolving. His health declined. Arthritis gnawed at his joints. He walked slower. He needed help with basic tasks. Eventually, he was moved to a medical block. Fewer hours outside. More silence. Less to do. Less to say. But even then, even after all the years, part of him still believed in the idea that BTK meant something. That those 3 letters had weight. That someone, somewhere, still whispered them in the dark. But they didn't. Because time has a way of starving monsters. Of stripping them of their mythology. Of revealing the small, pitiful truths behind their cruelty. And the truth of Dennis Rader was this: he was never a mastermind. Never a genius. He was a coward who chose helpless victims. Who needed to plan every move to feel in control. Who believed he could be both predator and neighbor, killer and father. Who believed he could wear the mask forever. But the mask had cracked. The fear had faded. And what was left was a man no one wanted to remember. He will die in that cell. Not today, maybe not tomorrow. But eventually, the breath will leave his body, and there will be no audience, no legacy, no thunderous headline. Just a small note filed away in prison records, and a box of personal effects nobody will want. The world outside has already moved on. The neighborhoods he once haunted have been repainted. The houses have new owners. Children play in those yards again without knowing the darkness that once lingered on the sidewalks. For them, BTK is just a faded story in a textbook, if it's mentioned at all. But some people will always remember. Not because of his name, but because of what he took. Families that lost sisters, mothers, daughters. There's a silence in their homes that never really healed. That kind of grief changes shape over time, but it never truly leaves. It lingers in photos that aren't updated. It lives in anniversaries nobody wants to acknowledge. It stays in the air like dust in sunlight, always there if you look closely enough. And that's the part Rader never understood. He believed his crimes made him significant. That fear gave him power. But the fear was never about him. It was about what he reminded people of, the truth that evil can live quietly, smiling behind wire-rimmed glasses, saying all the right things, mowing the lawn every Saturday. He was never powerful. He was hollow. And in the end, the world didn't fear him. It pitied him. He's still alive, sitting in that windowless cage, writing when he can, staring at the wall when he can't. Occasionally, his name pops up in an article or a late-night podcast. Sometimes a journalist reaches out for comment. But even that is fading. Because there are other stories now. Other monsters. New pain. Time doesn't stop for ghosts. And he is nothing more than that, a ghost made of paper and dust, bound to a prison bed with nothing left but the echoes of a name that once terrified an entire city. There will be no monument. No plaque. No caution tape left fluttering in the wind. When Dennis Rader dies, the world won't pause. His death will pass through a cold headline, maybe trend for a few hours, and then slip beneath the surface again. Another closed file. Another number buried in bureaucracy. And in the place where he once lived, life will go on. Laughter will return to the sidewalks he once patrolled. Lights will shine in windows he once watched. And the children of Wichita will grow up free of the shadows he left behind. That's how evil ends. Not in fire, not in drama, but in quiet. In stillness. In being forgotten. And maybe that's the most fitting punishment of all. If this story stirred something in you, if it reminded you that even the quietest corners of the world hold shadows, let that awareness stay with you, not in fear, but in vigilance. True monsters rarely look like monsters. They wear wedding rings. They show up to work on time. They go to church. But they never stop watching. So keep your eyes open. Trust your instincts. And remember, not all evil roars, some of it whispers. For decades, Dennis Rader believed he was smarter than everyone. He played games with police, wrote letters to the press, and lived among his community like a phantom in plain sight. But what he couldn't control was time. Technology changed. People didn't forget. And his need for recognition became his downfall. Behind every mask lies a motive, and sometimes, it's not bloodlust that drives a killer, but the desperate craving to be seen. As we look back on the horror he left behind, we're left asking, how many more monsters wear normal faces? And will we always see them in time? If this story moved you, share it. Subscribe for more deep dives into the darkness, and the light that eventually finds it.